Australia has produced some of the biggest rock bands of all time, including AC/DC, INXS, and Crowded House, to name a few. Rose Tattoo were incredibly successful in their own right with tours in the US and UK. However, I don't hear them talked about anywhere near as much as the other bands mentioned in this introduction, despite creating one of the greatest rock and sports anthems of all time in We Can't Be Beaten. This is also the band that inspired Axl Rose and Izzy Stradlin. Rose Tattoo are also fronted by one of the most memorable characters in all of rock and roll, Angry Anderson. So what happened to Rose Tattoo, and why didn't they reach the heights of the other rock royalty to come out of Australia? Stay a while as I take you through the rise and fall of Rose Tattoo. Rose Tattoo are a hard rock band hailing from Sydney, New South Wales, forming in 1976. The original lineup contained Tony Lake on lead vocals, founder of the band Peter Wells on slide guitar, Lee Johnston on rhythm guitar, Ian Ryland on bass guitar after learning to play the instrument in prison, and last but not least, on timekeeping duties, drummer Michael Vandersloot. This lineup would be short-lived, however, with multiple changes to the lineup before the year was out. Mick Cox joined on rhythm guitar, Angry Anderson joined on lead vocals, and Dallas Royal taking over drum duties. Before more members could make their exit, Rose Tattoo played their first show on New Year's Eve of 1976. It didn't take all that long before they gained a following in their hometown of Sydney, with members of AC/DC putting their stamp of approval on the band, recommending that Rose Tattoo be signed to the same label that they were on, named Albert Productions, a division of Albert Music, which is one of Australia's longest-running independent music labels. The next step after signing to a label is to release music, which is exactly what they did in the form of their first single, Bad Boy for Love, released in October of 1977, written by Ryland before the band suffered another exit. Another similarity that Rose Tattoo shared with AC/DC, apart from being label mates, is that they also shared the same producers with Vander and Young, taking on production duties for the track. The single did well, charting at 19 on the Aussie Singles Chart. Given the band were one member down, they eventually found their bass replacement in Chris Turner. More on that later as the band continued to rack up an extensive body count. To support the single, the band took off on a pub rock tour with the Angels and Cold Chisel. Chris Turner leaves the band, making way for Geordie Leach. Rose Tattoo's second single, Rock and Roll Outlaw, released 2 months later, before the band's debut self-titled album in September of 1978. The second single failed to crack the top 50. The self-titled debut album, recorded in Albert Studios in Sydney, released in November of 1978. The album was well received around the world, charting at 40 in Australia, number 2 in France, and number 5 in Germany. 1 year later, after a short stint and supporting tour of the album, Geordie Leach quits in May of 1979, with Lobby Lloyd coming on board in October of the same year. While the band enjoyed a stable lineup with Lobby Lloyd, they recorded and released some new music in March of 1980 in the form of Legalise Realise and a cover of Bong on Aussie, making it clear where they stood in a campaign attempt to legalise marijuana in Australia. After touring Australia for several years and 1 album under their belts, the band set off overseas to tour at the arse end of 1980. During this time, Lloyd left and Leach returned. The band's sophomore album, Assault and Battery, released in September of 1981, sharing the same recording studio and producers as their self-titled album. This album fared better on the Aussie charts, reaching a peak of 27 and landing at 40 on the other side of the world in the UK. Both albums peaked at number 1 on the heavy metal album charts in the UK. The singles off this album include Rock and Roll is King, Assault and Battery, and Out of This Place. Rose Tattoo set off to Europe for a second time to support their new album. There were multiple highlights of the tour, including a slot at Reading Festival, where Anderson made his head bleed after headbutting amps. If that wasn't enough, the band were proclaimed to be the loudest to have ever played the Marquee Club in London since Led Zeppelin. Mick Cox would go on to leave during this period of the band's history, with Robin Riley joining. Back in Australia, after showing the UK how us Aussies do it, the band commenced work on their third album. Scarred for Life, released the following year in October of 1982, produced for a third time by Vander and Young at Albert Studios. This album features the timeless single, We Can't Be Beaten, with the album peaking in Australia at number 11, the band's highest charting album up until this point. The other singles off the album include Branded and It's Gonna Work Itself Out. Off of a strong run of success, the band toured the US again, this time in support of Aerosmith and ZZ Top. These US tours were important as they were highly influential on what would become the glam metal scene, in particular Guns N' Roses. The band came back home after they finished touring the US. Unfortunately, more band members, 3 this time, would depart, leaving Anderson and Leach to carry on. Greg Jordan, John Meyer joined the band on guitar, with Scott Johnston filling in on drums to once again make the band whole. There were enough band member departures now for Angry Anderson to comment on the situation. He had the following to say: "People who got the chop were those who just couldn't cut it musically. They thought that a 30-day tour was a 30-day party. Some of them just could not be told. If you want to make it overseas, you have to approach it intelligently and professionally. After a rocky year, the band were hard at work recording the follow-up to Assault and Battery, Southern Stars, the band's fourth album in 8 years, released in 1984. This would be the end of the band's partnership with Albert Productions, including Vanda and Young. The album peaked at number 30 on the albums chart down under, with the sound of the band heading in a more album-oriented rock style, or AOR. The 3 singles off the album are I Wish, Freedom's Flame, and No Secrets. Leach was the next band member to go. The band set off on a tour of Australia in support of the album. This didn't last long, but as Anderson declared the band were going on hiatus due to his acting commitments, where he would play Iron Bar Bassie in Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome. Around this time, the lineup of the band consisted of Anderson, Johnston, Meyer, Andy Cushon on bass, and Tim Gaze on the slide guitar. They released a cover of Born to Be Wild, a first for the band under their new label Mushroom Records. The band suffered yet another casualty, with Meyer leaving. With the band losing so many members over the years, they decided to record their 5th album as a 4-piece. Beats from a Single Drum, released as the band's first full-length album under Mushroom Records in November of 1986, with Kevin Beamish handling production. Critics would call the album a departure from the classic Rose Tattoo sound, focusing on more pop-oriented ballads. This album was nowhere near as popular as some of their albums and failed to chart from what I could find online. The band were running out of steam after 10 years. After a short stint supporting the new album, the band was officially done for by 1987, with Anderson choosing to focus on his solo career. The song Suddenly was re-released by Anderson. Suddenly released to poor chart performance, but was later picked up and used in the soap opera Neighbours. The song had a new lease on life, charting at number 2 in September of 1987. Anderson, as an actor, has also featured in a few Aussie comedies including Housos, Fat Pizza, and Swift and Shift Couriers. After a few years, Anderson decided he wanted to bring back Rose Tattoo in the early 90s, thinking that enough time had passed to heal old wounds. Dallas Royal, however, passed away in 1991 from cancer, which delayed the reunion given the loss of their fallen brother. The band eventually reformed in 1992. The reformed lineup consisted of Anderson, Wells, Cox, Leach, and a new member on drums, Paul DeMarco. The band's first big gig since coming back was in support of Guns N' Roses' Australian tour. The whole thing went tits up again shortly after, disbanding and heading back to their solo projects. After approximately 5 years, the band made their second comeback in 1998, this time with Ian Ryland, the original bassist. However, this lineup would only last through the comeback tour before Leach came back, with Leach leaving again in 2000. If any band deserves a revolving door, it's this one. Rose Tattoo played the Wacken Open Air Festival for the first time at the turn of the millennium while they were touring Europe. A fair amount of this tour would go on to form the 25 to Life album in honour of the band being around for a quarter of a century. 2 years later, in 2002, the band would release their 6th studio album after a massive 16-year gap, titled Pain. Pain was released under the Steamhammer label in Germany, produced by Rainer Hansel. The album contained 16 tracks, the band's longest album up until that point, and a return to form with straight-up rock and roll after beats from a single drum. In the year after this, Cox rejoined the group, in preparation for album number 7, but was ultimately disrupted after Wells was diagnosed and passed away from prostate cancer on the 27th of March, 2006. Despite the setbacks and loss of another one of their brothers, the band were inducted into the ARIA Hall of Fame in September of the same year. Wells was informed of the pending induction and was thrilled to hear about it, with the band earning some well-deserved recognition of their contribution to music. 1 month later, in October, Ian Ryland passed away from the Big C as well. During the same month, several Rose Tattoo songs were voted into Triple M's essential 2006 countdown of songs, including Bad Boy for Love and We Can't Be Beaten. With 2006 behind them, Rose Tattoo released their new album Blood Brothers on the 16th of February 2007. This album contains the final work from Mick Cox, with Heavy Mag quoted as saying, "The band remained undiminished as perhaps the most powerful and ruthless barroom blues band to ever walk the earth." The album was produced by Mark Opitz and recorded at Studio 301 in Sydney. The album didn't chart and received little fanfare upon release. Months after the release, in April, Lobby Lloyd passed away at 65 from lung cancer. Months after that, in June, the band supported Guns N' Roses on their much-hated Chinese Democracy tour in Australia. In the latter half of the year, the band also supported Motorhead. With another year full of ups and downs, the band played Download Festival for the first time in 2008. 1 year later, in 2009, the band would lose another past member, with Mick Cox passing away from liver cancer in December. Through the 2010s, a few notable events happened to the band. In 2011, Rose Tattoo were able to celebrate their 35th anniversary with talks of a new album and demos flying around, but it wasn't meant to be for several more years. Another giant spanner was thrown in the works when DeMarco was arrested in 2014, pleading guilty to gun supply charges and sentenced to 6 years in jail. In 2017, a new lineup was announced consisting of Anderson, Dave Pritchard, Bob Spencer, Mark Evans, and John Watson. Watson would exit 1 year later to be replaced by Jackie Barnes, son of Jimmy Barnes. 2020 was the next major year for Rose Tattoo, touring Europe with a new drummer, Justin Ingariki, and releasing their latest album titled Outlaws under Cleopatra Records in March of that year. This album's a re-recording of their debut album with the track list shuffled around. The album was recorded at Hercules Studio in Sydney and produced again by Mike Opitz and Tim McCartney. Another of the band's previous members, John Meyer, passed away in September. Di Pritchard retired after 16 years in the band the next year in 2021. With DeMarco released from jail, he took over drumming again in 2022 when the restrictions were eased from COVID. Bob Spencer left the band in September of 2022 after 5 years, replaced by Ronnie Simmons. Since 2022, the band have toured all over Australia multiple times and even released a new song titled Hard Road on the 27th of February 2025. That's no mean feat considering Anderson is now 77 years young, although he did face some health scares and a hospital admission in 2023. Conversations are still being had about this legendary Aussie rock band around the internet, with one Redditor having the following to say about We Can't Be Beaten. Great song, love Angry's voice. Was a great period in Australian rock and roll music, now sadly decimated. A few Redditors were discussing the song Rock and Roll Outlaw. They sound good, there's a little AC/DC vibe there, with a reply saying, maybe that's because they're Australian and were produced by Harry Vander and George Young. Yes, Young, the older brother who played in the Easy Beats. A few people also mentioned that they'd never heard of the band before. Not really surprising if you're younger than 30. Geez, I must be getting old. After looking into the rise and fall of Rose Tattoo, it's clear that there were several factors that led to the band failing to reach the heights of bands such as AC/DC. The roster of the band was constantly changing for starters, going through a whopping 26 former members throughout their career. On top of the ever-changing roster, they decided to write ballads at one point, which would have just been insane whiplash for rusted-on rock fans of bands like Rose Tattoo and AC/DC. To top it all off, the band went on hiatus and lost all momentum they'd built. By the time they decided to reform, band members were starting to pass away. Decades later in the 2020s, the world was hit by a modern-day plague, with many bands failing to recover with enormous touring costs if you want to play overseas. It's a shame really, as Rose Tattoo were massively influential and will be remembered as one of Australia's greatest rock bands. Thanks for watching.